Jungkook digs into Jin's past in a podcast, but Jin's shocking revelation about his mother leaves everyone stunned. What did he do to her? You really did that to your mother? Jungkook's voice was barely above a whisper, yet the microphone caught every trace of shock in his tone. Jin only smiled, just a small, knowing smirk. The studio lights cast long shadows behind him, flickering slightly as if mirroring the tension in the room. The once casual atmosphere had shifted, the air now thick with something unspoken. The production crew exchanged glances. Some held their breath. Jungkook swallowed hard. He had interviewed many people, unearthed deep personal stories, even touched on sensitive topics. But this was something else. He leaned forward, his hands tightening on the table. Hyung, that's not something normal people do. Jin met his gaze without hesitation, his expression eerily calm, almost taunting. Do you want me to tell you everything? He asked, his voice carrying a weight that sent chills down Jungkook's spine. Jungkook barely nodded. His pulse pounded in his ears. Jin exhaled slowly, then spoke. All right, I'll tell you. How I almost made my mother disappear from my life forever. Cut to black. Jin's apartment felt strange that night. There was something in the air, something thick and suffocating. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel it pressing down on his chest. He stood by the window, staring at the glittering city lights. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, the vibrations breaking the silence. He didn't move. The screen lit up. A familiar name flashed. Mom. Jin's fingers curled into a fist. He didn't want to answer. Not tonight, because if he did, he knew he might say something he could never take back. And that's exactly what happened. The words he spoke to his mother that night, words that would change everything. If I had never been born, would your life have been better? The words left Jin's lips before he could stop them. A suffocating silence filled the air. The line didn't disconnect, but there was no response. Just the sound of shallow breathing on the other end. Then his mother exhaled shakily. Jin, why would you say something like that? Her voice was soft, almost pleading. But Jin could hear something else behind it. Something he didn't want to name. Guilt? Sadness? Or worse, agreement? He clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Just answer me, he said, his voice dangerously low. Seconds dragged into an eternity. And then, she hung up. Jungkook leaned forward, his fingers curled under his chin. He hadn't moved since Jin started telling the story. The tension in the room was suffocating. She hung up. Jungkook finally asked, his voice almost inaudible. Jin nodded. That was the first time she ever did that to me. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips, but there was no humor in it. He reached for the water bottle beside him, twisting the cap slowly, as if stalling. Jungkook frowned. What happened after that? Jin took a sip of water, then placed the bottle down carefully. He glanced at the camera, then back at Jungkook. I went to see her. Jungkook blinked. That same night. Jin nodded. I had to know. The room felt colder. Jungkook inhaled sharply. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear what happened next. But it was too late to turn back now. Jin stood outside his mother's house, his breath visible in the cold night air. His heartbeat was erratic, a wild rhythm pounding against his ribs. He didn't even remember driving here. One moment he was staring at his phone. The next, he was standing in front of the door he hadn't walked through in years. He raised his fist, knocked twice. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time. The porch light flickered on. Footsteps shuffled inside. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. His mother stood there, her face partially hidden in the dim glow of the hallway. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying. But she didn't say anything, and neither did Jin. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say to his own mother, and that terrified him. The door was only halfway open, but Jin could already feel the weight of the silence between them. His mother stood there, clutching the edge of the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes were swollen, dark circles shadowing them. Her lips slightly parted like she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Jin swallowed hard. "Can I come in?" His voice was quieter than he intended. For a moment, she didn't answer. She only stared at him, studying him in a way that made his stomach twist. Then, without a word, she stepped aside. Jin hesitated before stepping over the threshold. The air inside smelled the same as he remembered. Faint traces of jasmine tea, the wooden scent of old furniture, and something else, something bitter. His mother closed the door behind him with a soft click. And just like that, they were alone. "She let you in?" Jungkook asked, his voice tight with tension. Jin nodded. "I thought she wouldn't," he admitted. "But she did. And I think that scared me more than if she had slammed the door in my face." Jungkook frowned. "Why?" Jin leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. "Because it meant she had something to say." Jungkook didn't like where this was going. "And did she?" Jin's lips curled into a humorless smile. "Oh, she did. And I wish she hadn't." Jin followed his mother into the dimly lit living room. It felt smaller than he remembered, or maybe he had just grown too used to the space between them. She sat down on the old couch, motioning for him to do the same. "You didn't call back," Jin started, his voice carefully controlled. His mother exhaled, staring down at her hands. "No, I didn't." Jin clenched his jaw. "Why?" She looked up then, her eyes meeting his. "Because I didn't know how to answer you." Jin felt his chest tighten. "It was a simple question, Mom." "No, it wasn't." Her voice was suddenly sharp, cracking under the weight of something unspoken. Jin's fingers curled into his palms. "Would your life have been better without me?" He repeated, slower this time, forcing her to meet his gaze. His mother inhaled sharply, her hands trembling slightly, and then she finally spoke. "Sometimes, I think it would have." Silence. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jin stared at her, unblinking, as the words settled over him like a suffocating blanket. "You," his voice caught. He had expected hesitation, denial, maybe even anger, but not this. His mother's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I never wanted to feel that way," she whispered. "But there were times when it was just too much." Jin felt his breath leave him all at once. He had spent his entire life searching for answers, but now that he had one, it burned. Burned worse than anything he had ever imagined. Jungkook's mouth was slightly open, his fingers frozen around his coffee cup. "She actually said that?" he breathed. Jin nodded. "And for the first time in my life, I realized something." Jungkook swallowed. "What?" Jin's eyes darkened. "Maybe I was never supposed to be born at all." Jungkook's fingers tightened around his coffee cup, knuckles turning white. The tension in the room was unbearable, thick like a storm about to break. "Hyung, don't say that," Jungkook muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jin didn't flinch. He just sat there, calm, his fingers lazily tracing the rim of his water bottle. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something Jungkook had never seen before. Resignation. "I mean it," Jin finally said, his voice even. "That night when she said it, I felt like something inside me just disappeared." Jungkook exhaled sharply. "You can't just." "I didn't cry." Jin cut him off. "I didn't even get angry. You'd think hearing something like that would break you. But all I felt was empty." Jungkook was speechless. He had expected regret, rage, pain, but not this quiet, detached acceptance. "What happened next?" Jungkook finally asked. Jin leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I asked her why." Jungkook didn't even realize he was holding his breath. "And what did she say?" Jin's lips curled into a small, bitter smile. "She told me a story she had never told anyone before." Jin's mother looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the fabric of her sweater. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, fragile. "When I found out I was pregnant with you, I wasn't happy." Jin's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stay silent. "Your father and I, We weren't in a good place. We fought all the time. We were barely holding on. And then suddenly you were there. A life growing inside me when I wasn't sure I wanted to stay in my own. Jin swallowed hard. So what? You resented me? His voice was sharper than he intended. His mother flinched slightly but didn't look away. No, she whispered. I resented myself for not being strong enough to love you the way you deserved. Jin's breath hitched. I tried, Jin. I really did. But every time I looked at you, I saw everything I had lost. And sometimes I wondered if you would have been better off without me. Jin's vision blurred for a moment. Why didn't you just leave then? His mother let out a broken laugh. Because I was a coward. I told myself staying was the right thing to do. That maybe one day I'd become the mother you needed. But I never did I? Jin didn't answer. He couldn't. Because deep down he had always known. He had always felt it. That distance. That hesitation. And now she was saying it out loud. She had never been able to love him completely. And maybe she never would. Jungkook sat back in his chair, rubbing his face. Hyung, this is insane, he muttered. She actually said all of that? Jin let out a soft chuckle. Yeah, and you know the worst part? Jungkook braced himself. What? Jin turned to him, eyes dark, empty. I wasn't even surprised. Jungkook let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Hyung, I don't even know what to say. Jin smiled faintly, not out of amusement but out of something far more hollow. You don't have to say anything. Jungkook studied him for a moment. There was something unsettling about how Jin told this story. Not with anger, not with sadness, but with a strange sense of acceptance. As if he had stopped expecting love a long time ago. But you still went back to see her after that, right? Jungkook pressed. Jin's fingers tapped idly against the table. Yeah, I did. Jungkook hesitated. Why? Jin exhaled sharply. Because even after everything, a part of me still wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could love me. A heavy silence filled the studio. And did she? Jungkook finally asked. Jin's smile faded. I don't know. Jin sat stiffly on the couch, his mother sitting across from him. A small table separated them, but it might as well have been a canyon. She was staring at her hands again. Why are you telling me this now? Jin asked. His mother's shoulders tensed. Because you asked. Jin let out a bitter laugh. And if I hadn't? She didn't answer. That told him everything he needed to know. Jin clenched his fists. I spent my whole life trying to be a son you could be proud of. His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed through it. And all this time, you never really wanted me? His mother flinched. I never said that. You didn't have to. She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with something unreadable. Jin, I tried. I really did. Yeah. Jin's throat burned. And what do you want me to do with that? Pretend this conversation never happened? Pretend I don't know the truth now? His mother sighed, her fingers trembling slightly. Jin, I don't know how to fix this. Jin let out a breathless laugh, running a hand through his hair. Maybe you can't. The words hung between them, heavy and final. For the first time in his life, Jin realized something. Maybe love wasn't something you could force. Maybe some things were just never meant to be. Jungkook's throat felt dry. So what did you do? He asked hesitantly. Jin stared down at the table for a long moment before answering. I stood up, he said quietly. And I walked away. Jungkook's breath hitched. Just like that. Jin looked up, his eyes hollow. Just like that. The silence between them was deafening. Jungkook stared at Jin, searching his face for something. Regret, sadness, anything. But Jin's expression remained unreadable. You just left? Jungkook finally asked. Jin nodded. Yeah. And she didn't stop you? Jin exhaled, shaking his head. No. She just sat there. Didn't call my name, didn't ask me to stay. Nothing. Jungkook leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. Hyung, I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Jin's voice was calm, too calm, and that's what scared Jungkook the most. Do you regret it? Jungkook asked hesitantly. Jin let out a small, humorless chuckle. Regret? No. But does it haunt me? He glanced at Jungkook, his eyes dark, empty. Every damn day. Jin stood outside his mother's house, the night air cold against his skin. His breath came out in shaky exhales as he stared at the front door. He could still hear the faint sound of the clock ticking in the living room, the creak of the floorboards as his mother shifted in her seat. But she never came after him, not even a single step. Jin turned toward his car, gripping the keys so tightly his nails dug into his palm. He had waited his whole life for her to chase after him, and now he finally understood. She never would. His chest felt hollow as he climbed into the driver's seat, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the key. The engine roared to life, and just like that, he was gone. Jungkook frowned, still trying to process everything. So, that's it? He asked. You're just done with her? Jin was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke. Blood doesn't mean love, Jungkook. His voice was steady, final. I spent years trying to earn something that was never really there. Jungkook didn't know how to respond. He had never seen Jin like this before. So detached. So lost. What now? Jungkook asked carefully. Jin leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. I don't know. A heavy silence settled between them. Then finally Jungkook spoke. You know you're not alone, right? Jin turned to him, eyes unreadable. Jungkook swallowed. You still have us. Me, the guys. You have people who love you, Hyung. For the first time, something flickered in Jin's gaze. Something almost vulnerable. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. Yeah, Jin murmured, looking away. I know. But Jungkook wasn't sure if he believed him. Do you think she'll call you? Jungkook's voice was cautious, threading carefully over the fragile silence between them. Jin didn't answer right away. His fingers traced the condensation on his water bottle, slow and deliberate. Then, without looking up, he muttered, No. Jungkook inhaled sharply. How can you be so sure? Jin let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Because if she wanted to, she already would have. Jungkook didn't know what to say. The weight of Jin's words settled between them, heavy and immovable. So, that's it? Jungkook asked. You're just supposed to live with this? Jin finally looked up, and for the first time, Jungkook saw something raw in his expression. What else is there to do? And Jungkook hated that he didn't have an answer. The city lights blurred past as Jin drove aimlessly through the night. He had nowhere to go, no destination in mind. Just the road. Just the quiet hum of the engine beneath him. His mother's voice echoed in his head. I don't know how to fix this. Neither do I, Mom. His hands tightened around the steering wheel. A part of him wanted to turn around. Wanted to go back. Bang on the door. Demand something. Anything. From her. But another part of him knew it wouldn't matter. Some things were already broken beyond repair. The red glow of a traffic light bathed the inside of his car. Jin exhaled shakily, his fingers loosening their grip. And then, his phone rang. Jin's heart stopped for a split second. He fumbled for his phone. His breath caught in his throat as he read the caller ID. Mom! His hands shook. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, before he could stop himself, he answered. Hello. Silence. Jin's pulse thundered in his ears. Mom! He tried again. Still nothing. And then, Jin. Her voice was barely a whisper. He almost thought he imagined it. Mom, what is it? A pause. And then, in the quietest, most broken voice he had ever heard her use, she said, I'm sorry. Jin's breath hitched, and before he could say anything, the line went dead. Jungkook sat up straighter, eyes wide. She called you? Jin nodded slowly. Yeah. And she apologized? Jin let out a slow, shaky breath. She did. Jungkook leaned forward. Then what did you do? Jin swallowed. His fingers tightened around the bottle, his nails digging into the plastic. I never called her back. Jungkook's breath caught. What? Jin's gaze was distant, haunted. I couldn't. Jungkook shook his head in disbelief. But Hyung, she finally. It was too late, Jungkook. Jin's voice was quiet but firm. Some things, once they're broken, they can't be fixed. The words hit like a gut punch. Jungkook opened his mouth to argue, to say something, anything. But the look on Jin's face stopped him. There was nothing left to say. Jungkook shook his head, trying to process what he had just heard. Hyung, you didn't call her back? His voice was softer this time, cautious, almost disbelieving. Jin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His fingers intertwined, knuckles pale. No, Jungkook exhaled sharply. But why? Jin's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Because I was afraid. Jungkook blinked. He hadn't expected that answer. Afraid of what? Jin let out a humorless chuckle. That she'd take it back. That if I called, she'd tell me she didn't mean it. That she wasn't actually sorry. Jungkook frowned. But what if she was? Jin looked at him then, and the emptiness in his gaze made Jungkook's stomach twist. And what if she wasn't? Jin sat on the edge of his bed, phone still in his hand, the screen dark. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. I'm sorry. He replayed it over and over, dissecting every syllable, every breath. Was she crying? Was her voice shaking? Did she actually mean it? Jin closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. For years, he had wanted to hear those words, had dreamed of them, had convinced himself that if she ever apologized, if she ever admitted the truth, maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. But now that the words had finally come, they felt hollow, too late, too easy. If she had really meant it, why hadn't she said it earlier? Why wait until now after he had already walked away? Jin's fingers hovered over his phone screen, debating whether to call her back. But in the end, he didn't. Jungkook shook his head, his frustration barely contained. Hyung, I get it, I do. But what if she really was sorry? What if she finally realized how much she hurt you? Jin's jaw tightened. Then why did it take her this long? Jungkook fell silent. Jin exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. People always assume that an apology fixes everything. That just because you say sorry, all the pain disappears. But it doesn't, Jungkook. It doesn't erase the years of feeling unwanted. It doesn't undo the damage. Jungkook swallowed. So, you're saying you'll never forgive her? Jin hesitated. Then finally he said, I don't know. Jungkook frowned. But don't you think maybe forgiving her would help you? Jin let out a slow breath. Maybe. His voice was quiet. But maybe some wounds aren't meant to heal. Jungkook didn't know what to say to that. For the first time since they started the podcast, he realized something. Jin wasn't just telling a story. He was still living in it. The silence between them felt heavier than ever. Jungkook tapped his fingers against the table, his frustration barely hidden. So that's it? He asked. You're just gonna carry this for the rest of your life? Jin sighed, leaning back in his chair. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Exhaustion. Maybe. You say that like it's a choice, Jungkook. Jungkook exhaled sharply. But it is, Hyung. You can choose to forgive her. You don't have to hold on to this forever. Jin let out a quiet, bitter chuckle. You make it sound so easy. Jungkook shook his head. I never said it was easy. But don't you want to at least try? Jin's fingers tightened around his water bottle. And what if I do? What if I forgive her, and it still doesn't change anything? What if it just makes me feel worse? Jungkook hesitated. He had no answer for that, because deep down he knew Jin had a point. Jin sat on his couch, staring at his phone. The call log was still there. Mom, one missed call. His thumb hovered over her name. All he had to do was press it. But something inside him wouldn't let him. What if she regretted calling? What if she only said sorry because she felt guilty, not because she truly meant it? Jin had spent his entire life hoping she would love him. That hope had nearly destroyed him. He wasn't sure if he could survive being let down one more time. His chest tightened. Maybe Jungkook was right. Maybe forgiving her would help. But what if it didn't? Jin exhaled shakily. And then, his phone rang. His heart stopped when he saw the name on the screen. Mom. For a split second, his body moved on instinct. His finger nearly swiped to answer. But at the last second, the ringing stopped. And just like that, the moment was gone. Jin let out a slow breath, staring at the missed call. And for the first time, he wondered, was he making a mistake? Jungkook ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. Hyung, you don't have to do this alone. You still have us. Jin gave him a small, tired smile. I know, but there was something in his voice that made Jungkook uneasy, like he wasn't sure if that was enough. Before Jungkook could say anything else, Jin's phone buzzed on the table. Both of them froze. Slowly, Jin reached for it, his fingers hesitant. Then, when he saw the caller ID, his breath caught. Mom. Jungkook's eyes widened. Hyung, it's her. Jin just stared at the screen, his expression unreadable. The phone kept ringing. Jungkook leaned forward. Are you gonna answer? Jin's fingers hovered over the screen, and in that moment, everything felt like it was hanging by a thread. The phone kept ringing. Jungkook didn't dare breathe. Jin just sat there, staring at the screen. His fingers hovered over the answer button, unmoving, as if time had frozen. Hyung. Jungkook's voice was barely above a whisper. This is it. Jin swallowed. His heart pounded against his ribs, every beat hammering in his ears. Was this what he wanted? Was this what he had been waiting for all these years? The ringing stopped. Silence. Jungkook let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Jin's shoulders slumped. He placed his phone back on the table, his hands trembling slightly. She hung up. His voice was flat, empty. Jungkook hesitated. Do you think she'll call again? Jin didn't answer, because deep down he already knew the truth. Maybe this was the last time. Jin had always thought that leaving would feel freeing. That once he walked out of that house, once he finally stopped trying, he would feel relief. But all he felt was heavy. The past clung to him like a shadow, whispering every doubt, every painful memory. Would she miss him? Would she even care? He wanted to believe she would, but he knew better than to hope. Jungkook rubbed his hands together, trying to find the right words. Hyung, are you okay? Jin let out a soft laugh, but it was empty. I don't know. Jungkook hesitated before speaking. You know, you could still call her. Jin looked at him, something unreadable in his eyes. And say what? Jungkook swallowed. Anything, even if it's just to say goodbye. Jin exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached for his phone. Jungkook watched, holding his breath. Jin stared at the screen. His thumb hovered over the call button. Seconds passed. Then, he locked the phone and set it back down. Not today. Jungkook didn't push. Maybe one day Jin would call. Maybe he wouldn't. But for now, this was enough. And for the first time in a long time, Jin finally felt like he could breathe. That Jin's journey was never about fixing the past. It was about learning to live with it. Sometimes closure doesn't come the way we expect. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't holding on. It's learning to let go.